Hi all, I'm Jeanette Keynes from Jewelry Arts Inc. This is Chasing and Repousse 18. In this video, I'm going to show you some really important techniques you need to know for how to safely set your enamel. We're going to use some unorthodox materials like cardboard. Remain calm, it works great. So if you remember last time, we were talking about basically how to get the right height for my enamel. So because this Repousse piece has a curved bottom, I made a little jet set seat like so to snuggle right in there, and I pressed it level while it was still soft with a dowel, and I put my enamel in and I checked it, and of course I changed it like 55 times, as you can see by all the little trimmings I have here, where I would like take it out, trim a little bit off, melt it again, fit it in there. Because the whole key is, when you're setting anything, a stone or an enamel, height is like a huge part of the whole process. And if you don't get the height right, the odds are not great for a really happy outcome. So what I eventually did was I took this a little lower than I had it before so that I could fine tune at the very end. Because the whole thing with setting an enamel is, I'll do a little close-up of this so you can really see what I'm talking about. So here's a really extreme close-up of it, but you can see that silver bezel that's surrounding the enamel. I have to cover that up when I set, or else it's just really not going to look good. So that's what I'm considering when I'm getting my height, is I have to make sure I've got enough of my outside bezel to cover that up, and cover it up evenly also. There's nothing worse than it kind of peeking out in a spot or two. Can't have that. But when you make an enamel, you make normally an enameling cup out of silver or whatever. You enamel in there, you grind, and you polish. So all the way around the rim of the enamel is the original enameling cup that you can see, which in this case is silver. Usually we use fine silver because it doesn't tarnish, it's all good. But when you actually set, you need to make sure that your bezel covers that up, because that's not really a particularly attractive part of the enamel. And if you can see it in little bits, it's like a little distracting. So it's not really, your optimal goal is to have that covered up with the bezel all beautiful. But just like when you're setting an opal or anything else that's relatively fragile, you don't want too much bezel over on top of it that you're pressing down, because then you do kind of run the risk of maybe you're like pressing down real hard and you press down on the enamel or the opal or whatever too much and you get a crack, which is not something that you want to do. So what I usually do, I'm trying to get the perfect height, and you know how the search for perfect always goes, where it's like just enough to cover the edge of the original enameling bezel, but not so much that I'm going to end up, covering too much of my enamel, which is also not good, but just getting so much metal on top that I run the risk of cracking it. That's why, besides the fact that I'm pretty OCD, I usually am really tweaking the height to get it just right. So ultimately, I decided to have this, my little jet set seat in there, be a hair probably lower than I want, and to do just a tiny bit of fine tuning. Now, I know it is a shocking thing for you all to hear that we use cardboard to set underneath our enamels to set them sometimes. Now, why do we do that? The great thing about, usually when I'm saying cardboard, I'm not using like a big packing box or something. I'm usually taking an old postcard or a business card, something like that, cutting it out the same size as my enamel and putting it underneath. The benefits of this are that it has a little bit of give to it, because it's like, paper essentially. If you press down real hard, the paper will give a little. And, our concept is always like, if anything's gonna give a little, it's not gonna be the enamel. Enamel is glass. Glass doesn't give. If forced too much, it can crack. So it's nice to have something underneath that has a tiny little bit of give, like gives you a tiny bit of cushion. Do you have to use cardboard under your enamels? Like, no, there's been plenty of enamels I've set without any cardboard. But if I'm at the point where I feel like, okay, I need to make some fine adjustments, I'm usually going to go with cardboard because I feel like it's the safest thing. Now, here's something else to consider when you're setting an enamel. Very rarely is the counter enamel on the back actually perfectly level because, again, I'll do a little close-up of this so you can see. But normally when you make an enameling cup like this, you do counter enamel on the back, which just means a coat of enamel that ends up being just as thick as the layer in the front to equalize the pressure, because enamel and metal expand and contract at different rates. So a lot of times, unless your coat of enamel is very, very thin, if you don't have an equal amount of enamel on the back to equalize the pressure, your enamel will crack. Enamels are fiddly little creatures, as I'm sure those of you know who do enameling. So it doesn't always work, but that's usually, if we're doing, you know, like an enamel like this beautiful one, which you've seen the close-up of it before, you're going to do counter enamel on the back. Now, when you fire the counter enamel, usually you're using a layer of mica and you put it in the kiln and it fires, and as the counter enamel, you know, becomes basically semi-molten, you know, it kind of settles down. Now, is that going to happen perfectly level? Often, no, it doesn't. One side might end up being a little higher than the other. So sometimes when I'm setting, I actually need to kind of like shim up one little area or one side. And in that case, like I said, cardboard is ideal because I can cut a little semicircle or whatever shape kind of fits right in that area. Got a little bit of give to it, and it gives me the ability to really finesse the height and get it exactly the way I want it. If you don't want to use cardboard, you don't have to, because I know sort of the concept is like, what do you mean? Like an old postcard under my beautiful enamel, you know? But it works really, really well. So one of those naughty inside secrets. So what I did is I just took my enamel, I put it down on an old, actually, what did I use? I used one of my old, or actually maybe one of my current, I don't know, one of my business cards. I just drew a line around it and then cut out within the line, and I put it in here, and I'm gonna check the height. Another advantage that having cardboard in there gives you is that cardboard can be kind of peeled because it's like paper. You know, if you take something really sharp and pointy at the edge, you can kind of separate it and peel it off in layers. So if I need, you know, even a smaller adjustment, I can do that with using the same piece. So that's the whole dissertation on why cardboard has a lot of advantages and why it can often be really helpful when you're setting things like enamels. Now, obviously, you're not going to use this behind anything that's translucent because you would see it and that would not be cool, but for an enamel or something that's opaque, it's pretty handy. Another thing that I did between last video and this video is I went back and I really hadn't covered my bail very much with the jet set. I just pretty much got the rest of this like held in place, and I was like, you know, it'll be fine. Which, of course, by the way, whenever your own mind tells you it'll be fine, be afraid, be very afraid. I realized, like, yeah, but it's hollow, it's repousse. Like, what if the whole thing fell off the table and like hit it just the right way, or, you know, what if? It's basically the whole to fuck around is human, but to find out is divine retribution sometimes. So I was like, Jeanette, don't be dumb. Spend the extra 35 seconds. And I basically took some jet set, heated it up in the hot water, just like I did before with the rest of it, and basically like shoved it inside the bail and also kind of smeared a little layer over the top. So I'll show you the close-up, but again, it just means that basically now I won't need tape, and it'll be completely protected from any kind of dinging or slipping or dropping off the bench or, you know, any kind of fuckery, which, you know, so much of jewelry making is just protecting your piece against the normal shit that happens in life, but that you'll be really sad when it does. Like when you, I don't know, knock it off the bench and it ricochets and hits the edge of something else. And, you know, I mean, who hasn't had all of that kind of shit happen? Not me. I've had all of those things, and they continue to happen because that's life. So just always remember, I'm sure you've heard me say this in many videos, like if you're like, if it could go wrong, maybe it will. It's worth taking a little extra time and a little extra protection, and then just not having to worry about it. So just to show you, here's the close-up. There's my beautiful enamel. There is my little jet set insert that I made that's going to fit right in the bottom. and has a beautiful flat top, which is going to support the enamel. And then here's my business card and the little egg shape that I cut out. So my little egg shape is going to go underneath the enamel and on top of my little jet set platform there. And then I'll check the height again and we'll just see what we see, and we'll see if I need this at all, or if I decide to separate into layers, or if I cut it into a little section. We'll just see what we see. Okay, so I'm going to put everything in, including my cardboard, and we'll see if that's necessary. Oh, it looks like I need to trim that a little bit more so that it fits in there just so. All right, that fits now. So I'm going to put my enamel in. I'm going to kind of press it down and check from the side. Now, it's definitely, the enamel is definitely too high now with the cardboard in there. So I will either dispense with the cardboard completely, or I may shred it, so to speak, you know, like peel it into a couple layers. So let's see, but I'll show you a side view of this so you can see what I'm talking about. So you can see, even when I'm pressing this down, that that's too high, because that's not going to be enough bezel to cover up that little edge. So here's a real extreme close-up, but you see that silver edge? That's the enameling cup. It has to be covered up with my outside bezel, or otherwise it's just not going to look good. So that's the criteria that I'm using to make sure that my height is going to be right. I want just enough outside bezel to cover it, but not really too much further. And you see, like, it's just bounced up in there a little bit, but even if I press down on it, you see what I'm saying? It's just not going to be enough to cover that up. So I'm going to have to either separate my cardboard into some thinner layers, or maybe just take it out entirely. So since this is too high now, I'm going to pull my enamel out. I'm going to sort of separate my cardboard into a couple little thin layers. Maybe it's too much altogether. I'm about to find out. So I take something really pointy, like my beautiful dividers here, and if you just like poke the side, you see what I mean? You can kind of separate it and peel it off in layers. And that's super helpful when you're trying to get the height of something like just right. All right, oops, upside down. Better. But there's a couple spots, particularly right down here, that I just don't think that's going to be enough, you know, bezel there to cover that up. So I'm going to split the layer again and look at that. And like I said, it's possible I will dispense with it completely, but I really wanted to show how to use the cardboard in this video, whether I end up actually using it or not, because it's a really important tool, even though it's just recycling, really. But it can really be essential for getting the height right. So I wanted to make sure I showed it to you guys, even if I don't end up needing it. So it would appear that I can't peel these any thinner. I guess because this is really not that thick to begin with. If it were a little bit thicker like a postcard, I might be able to get more layers out of it, but I think I've done all I can because I can't quite get a separate layer. I can only sort of peel away a little part of the edge. So when I'm pressing this enamel down and looking at it from all the sides, I definitely have an area right over here that I've got more bezel showing. You know, I've got a little more bezel sticking up. The bezel, the outside bezel is level. It's not about that. But remember how I was saying before that a lot of times enamels aren't actually completely level because, you know, that the counter enamel kind of like settles down as it's getting fired, and it may be just, you know, a tiny little bit thinner in one section or another. So I think when I look over on this side, I feel happy with the amount of bezel I have sticking up, which, you know, I'll do a close-up and show you. But this section over here, I have a little more metal, a little more bezel sticking up, and I don't think that's a great thing. So I am going to cut this into a little like quasi half moon shape and use this as a shim like we were talking about before to raise this side up just a little bit so that it's more level. Yeah, I think I'm going to need to do that because otherwise I think my bezel is going to be a little uneven, which I don't want that. So over here on the sort of the top right, I hope you can see, I think I've got just the right amount of bezel sticking up above that when I press it over, it's going to cover that, you know, fine silver enameling cup really nicely. I mean, that looks to me like the right height, but I'll show you on the other side, I think I've got a little too much. So in this section right up here, I think I've got just a little too much. You see what I mean? I think that's going to cover it a little bit more than the other side. So I'm going to cut a little half moon shape of my very thin cardboard there and put it in this spot and hopefully kind of even it out a little bit. So I'm going to do that and we'll see how it looks. So I'm going to take my enamel out and I'm going to cut that little kind of half moon shape and fit it up in the spot where I feel like I've got a little too much. So you see, I'm going to start with that, put it in and see what that does for me. Oop, it's escaping. Let me try that. Actually, I think that did the trick. I'll show you a little close-up, but now it looks like I have a much more consistent amount. You know, I basically just raised the enamel up a tiny, tiny little bit in this section because I'm trying to go for as even of a height as possible, of course. Yeah, I think that did it. So, as it turns out, I'm glad I showed you the cardboard because it really does have its uses for stuff like this. So really that shows you the essence of why using something like cardboard can be so helpful. You can separate it into these like tiny thin little sections like this, but that little tiny bit under just the spot that we needed it, you know, that has made it perfect to set, and that's not an easy thing to do. So cardboard is a surprisingly useful tool. So I guess this is about as extreme close-up as you can get, but you see now what I've got there? I've got just enough bezel that it should cover that edge and should all be groovy. The rest of it looks good. So I think I'm gonna get ready to set, which I guess you can consider all this as getting ready to set, but I'm gonna get out my bezel roller, and I'm also gonna show you an important step about taping up your enamel. So the last thing that I'm gonna do before I actually set the enamel is I'm going to cover the enamel with a little masking tape, probably a layer or two. As I've often said, slipping happens. It happens to the best of us. And if I do slip, I definitely want something a little cushy on top of my enamel. You can use, I usually use painter's tape for this kind of thing. You could also use like double stick tape, that has that kind of cushy, like the cushioned stuff, because that would give you even more protection. You wouldn't peel the top layer off. You would just, cut it, peel it, stick it right on here, and you'd have kind of a poofy covering. The only thing about that is you have to make sure that you sort of trim it, because it can't get so close to the edge of the bezel that it actually like gets underneath where you're setting, because that would be bad. So just, you can use your own discretion, but something to kind of protect it a little bit, I usually like to do. I can kind of stick it right to the top and then trim. And we'll see what that does. Because like I said, I just need to make sure I don't end up with any of it like actually under my bezel when I'm setting, because that would be blarg. So I'm trying to kind of tilt the scissors away so that instead of cutting at the absolute outside edge, I'm cutting in a little bit more. We'll see how successful that is. I'll show you a little close-up. Actually didn't work too bad, but I do think there's a couple spots I'm going to kind of like peel up and trim a little bit more. So you can see that worked pretty well, but I really need it to look everywhere more like it looks right here, because if it's all the way to the edge, I'm probably going to end up with some tape in my setting, which I don't want. So I'm going to kind of peel it back a tiny bit in those areas, trim a little bit more off, and I'll probably put a couple of layers of this tape on like that. Like I said, it can't hurt to be a little careful. So you see, I trimmed it away from the outside edges a bit so that it won't muck up my setting. I think that looks pretty good. I'll probably put another layer or two on like that.